Hey everyone, we're the Stephen Queens. I'm Bella.
I'm Shannon.
And I'm Ashley.
Well, everybody, welcome back to the Stephen Queens. We're happy to have you here listening with us. Today we are going to be reviewing Psycho, which is a classic, and we can't wait to get into that. The first
Sorry, I had to. I couldn't resist.
The first thing that we're going to do is go into our new segment called Spill the Tea. So this is where we're going to just update you a little bit on our lives this week, and we'll tell you what we're drinking. So, Bella, how's your week been?
It has been busy and crazy, but I'm making it through. Today, I'm having a LaCroix key lime. I didn't ever like these, but for some reason I like this one.
I've always heard LaCroix, it's what water tastes like if it was held in a transportation truck that happened to have bananas in it. Or like...
Oh yeah. No, I call it fart water. Like, I think it's useless. But for some reason, I tried the key lime one, and now I bought myself a case of it, and I have a problem. So,
Well, good for you. Honestly, I love LaCroix, but I'm also kind of basic. So,
There you go.
all right, Ashley, how about you? What's going on with you this week?
Oh, very busy, just getting things wrapped up around the house. I decided to treat myself yesterday and buy myself a Kindle and put some books on there. I like hard copies of books, but I couldn't resist. There's so many different film studies books I want, and instead of paying the $90 for the book, I can pay $10 for an electronic version, so...
That makes a lot of sense. And also, just yay reading. Woohoo!
Yes, yay reading. Go read. And then today I'm drinking it out of my very own, the Stephen Queen's mug. Shout out to our friend Bryn for making our official stickers for us. Maybe someday we'll get real stickers. But I'm drinking Starbucks caramel apple spice because I'm obsessed with hot apple cider.
They have the best, too. And it has,
It's
whipped cream on top, and I'm fiend for it.
so good. What about you, Shannon?
All right. My week is a little wild, too. We're end week of the quarter at school. We have to get all these grades put in, so I'm catching up on that. I'm moving this weekend with one of my good friends, so that's really exciting, but just a little stressful, but good stuff. And I wish I was drinking something a little stronger, but I am drinking water.
Nothing wrong with that.
Yeah, nothing wrong with staying hydrated, I guess.
So, I guess it's time for us to move into the film that we're reviewing today, one of my absolute favorites, Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho. Yay!
And this is my first time ever seeing it.
I specifically told Bella a couple of weeks, months ago, she's like, maybe I'll watch it. I was like, no, wait to watch it until we review it. I want your review and opinion to be fresh on it. So I'm really glad that you did that, because I feel like watching it for the first time is so impactful. So I'm really glad that you waited.
Yes, it definitely was worth the watch.
So, Psycho was released in 1960 and directed by Alfred Hitchcock. It is based on the 1959 novel Psycho by Robert Bloch. Psycho is a 4-time Oscar-nominated film, a Golden Globe winner for Best Supporting Actress, and is ranked number 1 on the American Film Institute's 100 Years, 100 Thrills film series. And IMDb gives it an 8.5 out of 10, which I think is low because I think it should be higher than that. The genre is horror, mystery, thriller. And a little rundown for those who maybe it's been a little while since you've seen it. Phoenix secretary Marion Crane is on the lam after stealing $40,000 from her employer's pompous client in order to run away with her boyfriend Sam. Marion is overcome by exhaustion during a heavy rainstorm due to traveling on the back roads in order to avoid the police. She stops for the night at the eerily convenient Bates Motel and meets the polite yet highly strung proprietor Norm Bates, who is under his domineering mother's thumb. Marion soon will learn that mother doesn't always know best.
Dun, dun, dun. Sorry, I took your spot.
No, I'm glad you did it. I was hoping someone else would, because I never know what to say after those.
Oh my gosh, too funny.
So I think that with this film, there's so many different topics that you can talk about. I mean, this film is so incredible. I'm just a big fangirl of Psycho. But I think one of the big topics that a lot of people don't necessarily think of, or at least back then, is how Psycho covers mental illness.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think that's a big, big discussion that doesn't really happen. At least I haven't heard. But then again, I also just have not seen the film until now. So, with that, Norman Bates is said to have dissociative identity disorder. DID, dissociative identity disorder, used to be called multiple personality disorder or a split personality. Well, that term is outdated. So now it's called dissociative identity disorder. Identity disorder.
Words are hard. It's okay. We've all been there.
It's a tongue twister. So DID is a trauma response. And basically, from my understanding, now I should preface and say I don't know much about DID except for what research I did. And from my understanding, your body is the host and you have different parts, whether it be you and another or multiple alters. And then when you, the host, and the alters work together, it's called the system. I personally think everybody, if you're interested, you should check out her YouTube channel. It's called Dissocia DID, DISSOCIA DID. She herself has DID, and I am not even going to try to explain what it is because that's not my place. And I personally, it's a very in-depth, multi-part situation, and I personally don't have the qualifications to give you that information. So I highly suggest you check that out. But I don't know, and you guys tell me, I don't necessarily think, and I rewatched the ending scene, if they actually diagnose him with a term or like a condition.
So before I jump into that, I do just want to say, Bella, going off of what you said about DID, definitely check out that video. We'll post links to that on all of our social media platforms. And if you get the chance, go do some research. Mental Health Awareness Day was just a couple days ago, and we really want to try to help end the negative stigma against mental health. And the best way to do that is just by research and better understanding. So then going back to what you said, Bella, I know that the one thing that I read and heard is that they tried to diagnose him as being transgender. Obviously, they used the wrong term because it was the 60s, and they shut that down real quick. And from my understanding, from what I remember, they said that, and I think they might have said multiple personalities, but now I'm really blanking. I feel like because the guy who was talking was the psychiatrist. I don't know if they necessarily put a name to the term, and that's shame on me. I should remember that better. But that's a really good point about this diagnosis, if they had that from the psychologist.
I kind of like that they didn't, in regards to that, put a diagnosis on it, because I don't think that's fair to claim somebody has something and then potentially misrepresent it. With that, though, I do want to say that typically people with DID are not violent. These alters are harmless. This isn't a situation like this where one of the alters is a serial killer of some sort. I've never read a case about it.
That's the same thing. I have to agree completely. I do. I think that's the same reason why I don't really care for the movie Split very much. I felt like it was monetizing off of a mental illness that was being extremely over dramatized for a fear factor. And I think it kind of went to a farther extreme than Psycho necessarily did. But I would agree, in most cases, from my understanding, from someone who doesn't have a psychology background, most people who suffer from DID, or have DID, I should say, aren't violent.
And you'll see that alters can range from different ages, different genders, different nationalities. Your mind is an amazing thing, and people who have DID, their brain chooses how these alters are going to be made up, and it's not that they make that. Their brain decides. It's not the actual person. And to touch on the issue of Norman being accused, I would say, of being transgender, or the term that they use, which is extremely outdated, I thought that the psychiatrist, right, shut that down.
Yes,
and
he did.
I thought that was really cool, because explained, no, like, you're wrong. And for a movie to be made in 1960 and kind of explain something in a, I'd say, pretty decent way, I applaud them for that.
Color me impressed. Not that it doesn't have its other issues,
Sure.
but for that aspect, I was glad that they didn't try to play off of that like other horror movies have, which is always really unfortunate.
Psycho
Exactly.
did a lot better than other movies that have come out later, and I think that's a gold star for me.
Agreed.
Something that I really appreciate about Alfred Hitchcock is how obviously he's well known for all of his many films, but he's so well versed in having psychologically complex characters. That's honestly what I think he's best known for. Every single character or main character in his films are very psychologically complex. And another thing that we wanted to talk about was Hitchcock himself. He is one of the most influential filmmakers in the history of cinema. He directed more than 50 feature films in his career, and his career spanned 6 decades. He played with plots, with suspense. A common theme for him was innocent people being thrown into dangerous situations. And with this film, spoilers if you haven't seen it, Marion dies 45 minutes into the film. That is not very common. Hitchcock basically tells the audience, you think you know what the rules of watching a film is, but we're changing the rules here. And in some cases, there are no rules. And directors hadn't really done that before. Hitchcock has done so many influential things and so many crazy things. I mean, there's even, and we'll get into more of his influences later, but there's even a trope that's named after him called Hitchcock's Blondes. And that's basically a thing where the women in films, they're well known for, they're these beautiful, sophisticated, poised women who carry themselves with like an air of mystery and indirect sex appeal. They're usually the leading lady, and she carries the film as an unexpected source of deceit. And she is cunning and she's intelligent, and oftentimes she's a little bit of an adversary. And a lot of people seem to think that she represents Hitchcock's idea of a perfect woman, which you see this Hitchcock Blonde in so many different films that he uses, including Psycho and The Birds and Vertigo and so many films like that.
I just want to point out that my grandma is absolutely terrified of the birds, and I made her watch it when I was younger, and she screamed. So,
My mom is afraid of it too. Hi, Mom. Just kidding.
yeah, hi, Grandma.
I kind of want to be a Hitchcock blonde, or do I?
Here's my one thing that I'll say about Hitchcock. I admire his work as a director. For me, being a film studies minor, I admire that, but Hitchcock isn't without his problematic elements. So Tippi Hedren, she was the woman who played the female lead in The Birds, which is a great movie, watch it. But she said that Alfred Hitchcock was, in her words, sadistic to her while filming the attic scene in The Birds. And
How so?
all right, people who haven't seen The Birds, maybe fast forward a little bit. So in the attic scene, there are all these birds that are supposed to be attacking her. They were supposed to be like mechanical birds. For whatever reason, they weren't working. So he put real birds in there, and some of which he even rubber banded to her arms so that they would peck at her. At one point, they would peck at her eyes and at her. After she was done recording, she spent an entire week in bed because she was so exhausted. And I don't blame her. I mean, who does? Yeah.
Ew.
And then on top of that, she also says that he sort of grew sour towards her after she had turned down his sexual advances. And go do some more research on this yourselves. There's a lot more to it. I'm simply glazing over it. But she says that he even blocked some of her opportunities to be in other films by holding her to a 7-year contract. And it's important to remember that while we can appreciate the films, especially in regards of the actors and the cast and the crew for them, Hitchcock is idolized, but in today's society, that sort of behavior would not be tolerated. And a lot of it kind of reminds me of some of the Me Too movement and how we have really turned, rightfully so, on a lot of directors and producers who have really treated women and men, just people in general, absolutely horribly. So while I think it's important to see the importance of his films in film history, it's also crucial to remember that he himself is an extremely problematic character.
Well, that's really interesting you say that. That reminded me of the Me Too movement as well. And I'm glad that you brought that up because I didn't know that. So this is Shannon speaking, some of our viewers may have already known that. Good to know, like you said. It's interesting when you think about these people because there's Harvey Weinstein. That reminds me a lot of him. But the thing is, it's so crazy because during the Me Too movement, all of these artists started to become exposed, including one of my favorite writers. And I taught his book, Sherman Alexie, to my kids. And I just thought, it's such a strange and horrible kind of thing to have to decide is, do I just cancel this work? Or can we ignore, or not ignore, we should be made aware of what the person did, but can we still appreciate what they created?
I think, and this comes from a super, super privileged point of view, I still want to be able to support Janet Leigh and Anthony Perkins. I mean, these roles were breakout, big, huge roles for them and really did a lot for them. And I want to make sure that, you want to make sure that you can support them and be there for them. But it's also absolutely crucial to remember that we don't want to enable this type of behavior or support it in any way. So it's really a tough situation, but it's definitely something that we need to be mindful of because we don't want to support people who do that.
Absolutely.
So what I think I have to ask you two is, although she wasn't involved in any like sexual misconduct or anything like that, but J.K. Rowling, I mean, we all love Harry Potter. Like that was a big part of us growing up. And I remember Ashley and I would spend hours of the night researching wands that we wanted to buy on the desktop computer at a ungodly hour. But it's like, you want to support the actors and actresses. You want to support the creativity and you want to love what you love, but it's like you don't want to support somebody with that type of mentality.
So this is my point of view only. I used to be obsessed with J.K. Rowling. I now think she's trash. I think she has turned her back on a community who has loved her and embraced her and has been a safe space for them. And she has turned her back on them, and that is despicable, and it is upsetting. It's so heartbreaking. So what I have found is I am spending my money on Harry Potter merchandise that is not affiliated with her. So my boyfriend Nate got me this really awesome bookend that looks like Diagon Alley, and you can turn lights on, and there's a cool little potion thing. It's super Harry Potter themed, but it's by an independent company, so she gets no kickbacks. So for me, it's hard because Harry Potter was such a crucial part of my childhood. So I don't want to necessarily give it up entirely, but I don't want to support her at all. So what I've read online from different trans groups is if that's what you love, it's been important to you, hold on to it. But when you buy Harry Potter books or Harry Potter logo, merchandise, any of that, do it secondhand. Go to your half-price books or whatever local bookstore you have. Buy your books and merchandise from them because she won't get a kickback off of that. And I think if we can continue to do that, that will be a step in making the right direction.
I totally agree with what you just said, Ashley. I was so disappointed. And it's like, that's the hill that she chooses to die on, really, especially for people who have done nothing but support her. And it's just so disappointing to me. And I actually saw this group, I'm plugging them, we're not affiliated with them, but they're called the Gaily Prophet. So instead of Daily Prophet, the Gaily Prophet. And I follow them on Instagram. They're actually a queer and trans Harry Potter podcast. So they give a lot of tips as well on how to go about that. It's really cool.
I'm going to be listening to that. That sounds amazing, and I love it.
So anyway, back to what we were talking about earlier.
Very good points, though. All very good points. I think another really interesting topic that we should probably hit on is the filming style and the music selection for this film.
I will start off by saying I'm not very well versed in film studies, but as just an average Joe viewer, I like how you get conversation. He pans that, for his filming style, he pans the audio over what's currently happening. So you get these people talking, and you get these conversations happening in real time in tandem while you're viewing a scene. I think that's really cool. I loved that personally. I thought it was really interesting and well done.
I also don't know too much about the background of film studies and whatnot, but I do feel that this film really brought music as a way of influencing feeling into the mainstream. And correct me if I'm wrong, I believe that all the soundtrack was done on strings,
I believe so, yes.
which I think is really cool.
It's very interesting, and I'll move into more of the influence of the music in a little bit, but the shower scene in itself, its filming style was so unique, and the music on top of that, it's known as one of the best 45 seconds of cinema ever. So like that shower scene was shot from December 17th through December 23rd, and it features 77 different camera angles and I believe 50 cuts. That's a lot of work. In this film, Hitchcock sort of pioneered the quick cutting aspect of film. So, in the shower scene, when you think about it, it really doesn't show most of the things that we think we see, except for like 2 split seconds of knife and whatever. But the knife we never actually see it touch the flesh. But through these quick series of edits and jumping around between all these quick cuts, it's 45 seconds, somewhere between 50 and 90 cuts. But Hitchcock is able to visually suggest the illusion of graphic violence without ever having to actually show it. I think of Bruce Willis when back in the day he was a really big action star. He's a little older now, but still does a lot of action films. When he's a little bit older now and he's shooting a scene and he magically kicks everybody's butt in a scene of quick shots, it's based off of Hitchcock's quick cutting film style. Because, in reality, Bruce Willis at this age, no offense, Bruce Willis, is probably not gonna be kicking everybody's butt. He's a little bit older. He doesn't have time for that. But we have that to thank because of Alfred Hitchcock.
It's interesting that we talk about all of these topics as we go along with the podcast because I'm learning so many new things. I love being friends with a film studies minor.
My film studies knowledge is minimal compared to so many other things, but that's why I love reading about it because it's so informational and I just love film, so I love learning about it.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. And again, in so many episodes we have mentioned that we find just the suggestion of violence to be terrifying rather than actually seeing every gory detail. So that's fascinating too.
I would agree, Shannon, 100%. So I want to move into some of the influences that some of the filmmaking has had on other films. Fun fact, when they made Jaws, when that film came out, one of the film's stated aims was that they wanted to make America's beaches as empty as American motel showers were when Psycho came out. And a big part of that is done via the music. There had been soundtracks to film and things like that before, but this film was so influential in how they used music to staple a film. I mean, please excuse my singing. I'm not a very good singer, but in Psycho, that's Psycho. Same with Jaws. Dun 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 dun. They're staples that have gone along with those films because they've been so influential.
And it worked because when I was younger, we had a wedding that we had to go to, and it was in a part of town that wasn't as great. And so we had to stay at a motel. And I remember we were really young. I think I was probably like 10. So my brother would have been like 7, 8. And my dad goes, "All right, kids, we're going to the Bates Motel." And we're like, "But it's not called that." He's like, "It's the Bates Motel." And I never really registered until I got older. And I'm like, oh, yeah, it was the Bates Motel. Yeah, we did not sleep that night. We stayed up near till 2 a.m. and got out of there.
I love your dad. That's amazing.
Yeah.
That would really creep me out too, honestly. Glad
Yeah.
you hadn't seen the movie.
I know.
Right? It's funny because you wouldn't really think of a movie as being influential, and obviously it has because it's influenced so many people, but the movie itself has influenced so many other movies as well. So like one of the big things that was a really big influence is the camera angles that Alfred Hitchcock used. He uses a lot of first-person camera angles. which is a little bit more, when you think about it, a good example is in the scene where Marion gets not really pulled over because she's already pulled over, but when the cop pulls up on Marion and they're having the conversation and you get a picture or a close-up of just her face when she's talking, and then you switch over to the police officer. And even when just Norman and Marianne are talking in the parlor. A lot of films at that time would use a third-person camera angle, which is more just outside looking in on the scene as they would talk. And doing this first-person shooting helps the audience relate to the characters more. So you care more when Marianne dies, or honestly, you care when Norman is trying to sink her car into the swamp. You would think, yeah, I don't want that car to sink, but subconsciously you find yourself rooting for that car to sink because you don't want Norman to get in trouble.
That's interesting that you say that. He does a good job of making you sort of feel bad for this guy. I feel bad for Norman.
Oh, yeah.
But then I also feel awful, obviously, for poor Marion. She is turned from a criminal of sorts into a victim based on what he does to her. So that's also interesting too.
Most definitely.
I also feel guilty when I was watching it. Again, I had never seen this. I turned it on, and then the scene where Norman Bates is introduced, I go, that's a good looking man. And then I was like, oh, that's a good looking man. That doesn't feel right. So
Well, that's what people thought about Ted Bundy.
Yeah.
True. Good-looking people. Good-looking people can get away with a lot.
Yeah.
I know. That sucks. What's interesting is that it goes off what Bella was saying and what Ashley, you were saying earlier. When Bella said, oh, he's good looking, people thought, you said, Marion ends up dying so early on. And he breaks these rules because I read this interview where they were talking about how Hitchcock said, you're wondering, is this guy Norman, is he going to replace Sam? What's going to happen? Oh, never mind, he kills her.
Right. That's what's really great is he introduces this, I don't want to say lovable because that's not the right word, but relatable, this sympathetic character that is not a hero. He's sort of an anti-hero in his own way. And that's something that's so common in film now, is not so common, but is more common, is the switch of the main character. Psycho is one of the first films to switch protagonists partway through the film, and then to make him an anti-hero protagonist as well. You don't see that very often. And one of the films that uses it today is like Scream. The girls that you see in the beginning of the film really aren't the main characters. Love You, Drew Barrymore, but her part was short. And this film really started that off.
I think something interesting that Hitchcock did, and I think it's a part of the Hays Code that we're going to touch on later, but is making criminals likable. And yeah.
Oh yes.
And the thing is, you almost feel bad for Norman, right? You think, oh, he's got this mean mom in the beginning. She's so mean to him. So like, no wonder he's acting the way he does. And you almost feel sympathetic, and you realize he's a little quirky. So you get that feeling of sympathy, even though he's doing this heinous act on someone. Part of you is like, it's okay, Norman. Like, you want to pat him on the back or something.
But then at the end, you end up realizing, yeah, his mom may have been a little overbearing, but it was his jealousy of her and her boyfriend that really led to his own demise. So, and at the same time, you feel guilty about feeling sympathetic for him.
Yeah, and I think that we've gone into this before where we have this controversy of Hannibal Lecter. We talked about, you want to like these people, and it is a little concerning because, they're romanticized, right? And so it goes back to good-looking people get away with a lot. Well, so does the quote-unquote nice guy. But you can be nice on the outside and not really be so nice on the inside. And that reminds me a lot of the show You, where Joe, if any viewers have seen this show, it's a great show, but the whole show is shot from the perspective of the stalker. And a lot of people hate the girl that he's stalking. And it's really disturbing me that you would think she's such a B-word, she's this and that, he needs a better girl. And I'm like, well, maybe she needs somebody who's not manipulating her and stalking her. And so you get this just weird thing because we want to like the bad guy. And it's such a strange concept and such a strange comment on our society.
Yeah, so I'm actually reading that book, and by reading, listening to it on tape, and I found myself going, oh my gosh, he's so nice. Oh my gosh, he's so creepy. Oh, he's so
Ella, that is one of
what
the best books I think I've ever read.
phenomenal.
I read it like, I don't mean to sound hipster, but I read it like a couple years before the TV show came out. And I remember thinking, this is something new here. Like, this is really good.
Yeah, very well done. Highly recommend you check out You. But also, with talking about how Psycho influenced other things, I feel like we should talk about what influenced Psycho itself. And the biggest thing that I saw was Ed Gein. And if you don't know, Ed Gein is a serial killer. You may know him from This Sounds Bad, his works of what he considered to be art. He, how do I say this, dabbled in leather of the human skin type. We talked about this actually in our
First
Silence of the Lamb
episode.
episode. Yeah. So another thing about Ed Gein, though, which relates mainly to Psycho itself, is Ed Gein was famous for digging up graves of women who were recently buried who reminded him of his mom. Well, Norman digs up his mother's grave and preserves her, which also leads into human leather type preservation. He's preserving these pieces where Norman preserves death with his taxidermy. And I just want to shout out to Cleveland Curiosities. If you are interested in taxidermy, which I never thought I'd say this, check them out because they have ethical taxidermy. So Cleveland Curiosities, check them out.
That's a really, really good point, Belle. And I feel like you see a lot of preservation throughout the entire film. I mean, you see all of these birds, which end up being so symbolic. And even at the very end, something that not a lot of people necessarily would catch on, when Norman is in jail and he has the blanket wrapped around him, and you hear that voiceover that's Mrs. Bates' voice. Psycho wasn't necessarily the first film to do that, but it was much more common after that. But when you hear that after they're done, there's this haunting moment when Norman looks up and looks directly into the camera and almost breaks the fourth wall, and you see this superimposed picture of the mother's corpse, like the face, overlapped with his, which is representing her fully taking over. And in a way, even though she's dead and she's been dead for a while, she is preserved within him.
That's really, really cool. There's actually a lot of symbolism, motifs, irony in this movie, and it's really fascinating. But that is obviously one of the biggest ones. We talked about birds in general being a motif. And for those listeners who are tuning in, and maybe not super familiar with some of these terms, I'm an English teacher. Woohoo! And just to make this more clear, symbols are images, sounds, or words that represent something else. Motifs, on the other hand, are images, ideas, sounds, or words that help to explain the central idea of a literary work, which is a theme. So 3 of those things are different. Symbols don't necessarily recur over and over. They can just recur once or twice. Motifs are very, very similar to a symbol, but they recur often. So that's the difference. So you're talking about a motif if it's often recurring, a symbol if it only recurs once or twice, and then a theme is the central idea of a literary work. So sorry to get English teachery on you, but just in case you needed some clarification.
I love that. That's really good to bring that up.
And so what is interesting, we see that motif of birds, and there's a lot of bird-related language in here. Marion's last name is Crane. We see those preserved birds. A lot of them are obviously trapped, and birds are not what you would normally consider to be trapped, but some people do keep them as pets. And so that is, of course, a recurring symbol is being trapped, right? And so Marion is the bird who is trapped in this situation. We can also consider Norman as the bird being trapped in this situation. But also, what's interesting is Hitchcock has been known to have said he specifically gives crows and owls their own one-shots, and Hitchcock says owls belong to the night world. They are watchers, and this appeals to Norman's masochism. He knows the birds, and he knows that they're watching him all the time, and he can see his own guilt reflected in their knowing eyes. And in that way, Norman is like the owl. He says they are the night watchers. Well, we know Norman has that hole that he looks through to watch Marion undress. So that he literally is compared to the owls. We have other motifs of mirrors and reflections. Again, we have that duality that runs through Psycho. So mirrors, they can reflect you back to yourself. You get that introspective nature, and that sort of does go into what we just talked about with him seeing his own guilt, because he is compared to a bird in a certain way, and so he sees his own guilt through the taxidermy. He also sees through these mirrors that occur in the film his own guilt that way.
Shannon, that's such a great point that I wouldn't have necessarily thought of right off the bat. But I think it's interesting saying that Hitchcock kind of compared him to an owl, because in my mind, I view owls as predators who hunt. And in the same way, while Norman is very meek at times, we also see him get very short with Marion when she starts questioning his mother. And in a way, I sort of view Norman as a predator himself.
Great point. And he is a predator. I mean, he killed his mother out of jealousy. We need to keep reminding ourselves of that, because we often forget that, again, because for some reason, we want to like this guy. So those are two of the big motifs that occur. Another thing that my English teacher mind loves is irony. So we teach irony, situational, verbal, and dramatic. So something here, of course, near the beginning, when Marion is driving and she runs into the police officer, she's sleeping in her car, and he says, "You should be going to a hotel just to be safe." Well, obviously, that didn't end up being the case, so that's ironic. Sam's letter. So what's interesting is that he at first says that he does not want to marry her for financial reasons, and so she steals the $40,000. However, at the end, we see Sam writing a love letter in which he reverses his conditions and he agrees to marry her, even if she's broke. So that's like that sad irony there too. Of course, we get some irony with the shower. So that literally represents her, Marion. She's deciding to return the money and come clean. Well, she takes that shower and she's coming clean, and then she ends up getting murdered. So there's a lot of situational irony in which we expect one thing and something else happens.
Those are all really, really good points, Shannon. I really appreciate that. I think another interesting figure and especially how she's represented in the film is Janet Leigh herself, and some of the symbolism around her and just her character in the film. I think it's really interesting. So for those of you who don't know, fun fact, Janet Leigh is Jamie Lee Curtis's mother. Super fun fact. And then John Carpenter even said that he got a lot of inspiration from Psycho and ended up hiring Jamie Lee Curtis as the lead actress, sort of because of that. And even the knife that you see that Norman uses to kill everyone is almost identical to the knife that Michael uses in Halloween, which is really cool. And then on top of that, so Marion's husband, Sam Loomis. Sam Loomis, where have we heard that name before? Oh yeah, the psychologist in Halloween.
Oh
Boom!
my gosh, Ashley, I was like, that is such a strange coincidence. It's like the duck thing all over again when I hear the duck quacking, and I'm like, is there a duck? No, that's not a coincidence.
Not a coincidence. 100% intentional, which I love that sort of overlap type of thing. But it just shows how influential this film and Janet Leigh was on so many different levels.
Very cool. I love that. Fascinating.
So one of the last topics that I think is really important to discuss when we talk about Psycho is the production code. And Psycho is a prime example of the type of film, especially in the 60s, that appeared during the erosion of the Hays Code. The Motion Picture Production Code was a set of film industry moral guidelines for the self-censorship of content that was applied to motion pictures released by major studios in the United States from, I think, like 1934 to about 1968. But it's most commonly known as the Hays Code after Will H. Hays, who was the president of the Motion Picture Producers and Distributors of America. Basically, in layman's terms, it was a voluntary code for film companies, but it was mandatory for filmmakers. If they wanted their films to play in American theaters, they had to follow this code. So I'm not going to go into extreme detail on the Hays Code. NPR has a great rundown on it. I believe it's Arizona State College, I think, has another really good rundown, and I think actual layout of the code itself. But a few of the key restrictions were no picture shall be produced, which will lower the moral standards of those who see it. Hence, sympathy of the audience shall never be thrown to the side of crime, wrongdoing, evil, or sin. And obviously we see that here with Norman. We somehow subconsciously end up siding with him, and almost, at least I found myself rooting for him and not wanting to get in trouble. Maybe rooting isn't the right word, but I didn't want him to get in trouble because it's not his fault that his mom did all that. Joke's on me. Another key restriction is that methods of crime should not be explicitly presented, i.e., theft, robbery, arson, etc., etc. It should only ever be hinted at and never shown in full detail. Again, in Psycho, you see Norman physically hiding Marion's body. You see her get murdered. Well, you don't see knife going in. You see her get murdered. You see him pushing the car into the swamp. So that was going completely against the Hays Code. As well as sex or perversion should never be shown, especially homosexuality, or kind of tying into another one is no scenes of seduction or overly passionate sexual scenes. At the time, perversion would be considered Marion and Sam having sex without being in a married relationship. That at the time was sort of considered a perversion or kind of out of the norm. And it showed that. It showed Marion in a bra twice, and then it showed her basically naked without showing anything another time, which is extremely rare and out of the blue. Now, I'm not going to sit here and just bash the Hays Code because they had some good points too. Like, one point that I think is good is children's sex organs should never be shown. I agree with that. That should not be shown. That's a good point. But otherwise, a lot of them are a little bit outdated. And Psycho was released during the decline of some of these practices. And, obviously, as I said, Psycho bends a lot of those guidelines. One such guideline that they really bent that was a big issue is where Marion flushes the paper with the numbers of how much cash she had spent down the toilet. At that time, no flushing toilet had appeared in mainstream film and television in the United States. That was unheard of. Many people, it's not confirmed, but many people think it was the first time a toilet was shown on the big screen. Another one, the blood that was being shown going down the drain of the shower would have never been acceptable if it was shot in color. And this was one of the many, there are a lot of them, but one of the many reasons he filmed in black and white. Basically, Hitchcock had to fight for a lot of the film to stay how it is. A lot of these parts were definitely censored in other countries, but there's so much controversy just in how it was filmed and how it was presented to America as a whole. That was your film studies lesson of the day. Definitely go do more research on it if you're interested, because that was a very brief glazing over of everything. And with that, that's our review of Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho. I think with that, we should probably get into our ratings and reviews. So, Bella, what do you rate Psycho?
I, myself, am not a big fan of old horror movies. And I know that's probably going to rub some people the wrong way. But I will give this one an 8.5 because I very much enjoyed it compared to what I thought I was going to. There's obviously some things that are not to my liking, but for 1960, that's a pretty solid movie. So I'd say 8.5 out of 10 crowns.
Nice. What about you, Shannon? What do you give this movie?
I would say 9 out of 10 crowns because I like older movies. I thought it was really interesting. I really liked how well done it was. I thought it was smart. There were a lot of aspects I enjoyed of it, and I love the suspense. So I'll say 9 crowns.
I have to say, I think I give it 9 crowns as well. Obviously, as I stated when we started this is one of my favorite classic horror movies, if not my absolute favorite. There's only one other that I think reaches up there, and I don't know if we'll ever review it, but this is hands down one of my absolute favorite. I give it a 9 only because of the depiction of mental illness / Hitchcock is kind of cringy at times, but otherwise it's near and dear to my heart. But before we wrap up, I have some fun facts for everybody.
Woohoo!
Thanks for always wooing for me.
I got your back.
Fun fact number 1, when the cast and crew began work on the first day of filming, Alfred Hitchcock made them raise their right hands and promised to not divulge one word of the story to anyone. Hitchcock also ended up withholding the end part of the script from the cast until he absolutely needed to shoot it. He was obsessed with making sure that no one found out what happened at the end of the book or the big twist. In fact, I've read that when the book came out and he read it, he liked it so much, he went around to as many stores as he possibly could and bought out every single copy of the book so no one would have been able to read it and know what the ending was. Super fun. Fun fact number 2, Hitchcock so badly wanted to make this movie that he deferred his standard $250,000 salary in lieu of 60% of the movie's gross profits. He filmed this with Paramount Pictures, and they thought that this movie was going to do extremely poorly at the box office, so they agreed, thinking that they wouldn't even have to pay him $250,000. Paramount was really extremely against this film from the get-go. The fact that he had refused to let the Paramount producers read the script only distanced them further, but in the end, Hitchcock's personal earnings from the film exceeded $15 million. If we adjusted that for inflation today, that amount would be just over $120 million. So he made the right choice, I think. Fun fact number 3, although Janet Leigh was not bothered by the filming of the famous shower scene, when she finally saw it on film, it profoundly moved her. She later remarked that it made her realize how vulnerable a woman was in the shower, and to the very end of her life, she always took baths. Fun fact number 4, every theater that showed this movie had a cardboard cutout installed in the lobby of Alfred Hitchcock, pointing to his wristwatch with a note saying, "The manager of this theater has been instructed at the risk of his life not to admit to the theater any persons after the picture starts. Any spurious attempts to enter by side doors, fire escapes, ventilating shafts will be met by force." Basically, the entire objective of this very out there policy is to help you enjoy Psycho even more. And they did this, and it was such an interesting campaign. It was like a marketing campaign. Initially, movie theater managers were really upset by it, but in the end, they found that they had long lines of people waiting to get in, and it drew in more business. And the final fun fact I have for everybody, the blood in the shower scenes was made with chocolate sauce since they didn't have to necessarily worry about color, and the stabbing noises that were made were created by stabbing into melons repeatedly.
I will never ever cut a melon the same way again.
I cut into it thinking like, oh geez, this doesn't sound very good.
Yeah, holy cow. All right. Well, thank you for those fun facts, Ashley. As for everybody else, please, please, please comment on our posts. Tell us what you think. We want to hear your thoughts. Follow us on either Spotify or Apple Podcasts, and please leave a review for us. We love to hear your thoughts. We really do. On Facebook, you can follow us at The Stephen Queens. Again, for your reference, Stephen is Stephen, based off Stephen King, of course. On Instagram, you can follow us at The Stephen Queens. And on Twitter, we're at Stephen_Queens. Please give us a shout out.
Join us in 2 weeks for our next episode. Thanks for tuning in. This is Bella.
This is Shannon.
And this is Ashley. Stay creepy.